Okay, hello everyone. Um, my name is Patrick Rérat. I'm the co-director of the UVEMA, which is the Observatory for Cycling and Active Mobilities at the University of Lausanne. And it's a great pleasure for us to see you again. We hope that you had a nice summer and some nice cycling tours. And we are very happy to start today our new seminar series, which is about cycling urbanism, learning from the Dutch experience. And as you can see on the screen, we'll have 4 events this semester. Today, we are very happy to welcome George Liu. I will introduce him in a few minutes. On the 9th of November, Melissa and Chris Bruntlet will speak about the human case for fewer cars in our lives. On the 23rd of November, we will have our first event on campus. So sorry for those of us who are away and not in Switzerland, not in the region of Lausanne, but we have organized the projection of the film Together We Cycle and a roundtable after the film to discuss a little bit of the difference between the Dutch case and Switzerland. And that film is also the opportunity for us to celebrate our 3 years as the UVEMA was founded in November 2020. And on the 14th of December, Elite Talents will speak about bicycle infrastructure and the fact that the devil is in the details. So you'll find all the information on our website. You can register as you did today to get the Zoom link. So today we're very happy to welcome Dr. George Liu. George is Director of Learning at Urban Cycling Institute, educating professionals and the public about how ideas from urban design can guide the creation of attractive environments that encourages cycling as a practical and desirable mode of transport. He collaborates with the European Institute of Technology and Urban Cycling Institute and has produced and hosted the video series City Unboxed, as well as urban mobility book reviews. And you can, we may send the link, but you can Google also his name and find these videos. They're very interesting and very helpful if you want to discover the infrastructure in some European cities, or if you want to know more about some classic books in the field of mobility or cycling. He specializes in high-quality online learning and has authored numerous online courses, notably on Coursera with the University of Amsterdam. Dr. Liu is an appointed lecturer in urban mobility futures at the University of Amsterdam, and we are very happy that he has accepted our invitation. And just before giving him the floor, just some housekeeping stuff. Please switch off your camera to save broadband. Ask your question in the chat. And with Bengt Kayser, who is the other director of the UVEMA, we will gather the questions and moderate the discussion after George's presentation. So thanks again, George, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And very good to see a pretty full house today, even though I can't see you on the room, but it's showing about 50 people. So thanks for taking the time, both to the organizers and also to the people here today. So the title, when I originally submitted this presentation, is about thinking about cycling experience, cycle highways, methods for human-centered design. You know, it's along the lines of what is good urbanism, but then applying that concept to cycling. I thought a bit more of the presentation than what I wanted to talk today, and it turns out an alternate title could be this, also known as, but beyond stated preferences, taking the cyclist's perspective to explore the motivation and meaning of cycling, which is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. So this presentation will try and bridge the gap between the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of cycling and what it means for you. So I'm Dr. George Liu, and I've lived in the Netherlands for 6 years. So this is a Dutch-centric perspective. Although I must say, just chatting with the organizers, that now that it's been 6 years, I'm a lot less, amazed by all the cycling infrastructure, and perhaps this can be a bit of a critical perspective to Dutch cycling, and also some ideas about how to apply, I'd say, the more ineffable points of cycling into other places around the world. So I'm going to take you on a journey. We're going to start with ideas around 2 papers that I published. This is a while ago, around cycling experience and bicycle highways. I'll show you 1 case study that we did in the Netherlands. And then after that, I'll introduce you to a few snippets of videos I've made to give you ideas of how these ideas can be applied in practice to different contexts around the world. Okay, so let's 2 papers you might be interested. We'll leave links for you at the end of this talk. Is one, what was part of my PhD dissertation, practitioner's perspective on user experience and design of cycle highways. And then another one we co-authored with the University of Utrecht and a few practitioners, wayfinding for cycle highways, assessing e-bikes user experiences. So the commonality is user experience, and that's something that really interests me, especially in the Netherlands, where we can talk about a lot of positive things around user experience rather than just nitpicking about the negatives. But I'll give you both sides of the perspective. So here is something to think about, right? So what do we mean when we talk about a good experience? This is adopted from Maslow's hierarchy, right? We have our basic needs, which is, say, where much of bicycle infrastructure design is focused on, which is safety and security, right? You cannot have the rest. You cannot have a good experience if you're always in fear of your life, right? So that's FUM's one fundamental, the double if, right? So if and that's required for good cycling infrastructure. And then as we move up the hierarchy of needs, then we get into issues that are less quantifiable. And that's where this argument is going, is that not all good design is capable or lends itself to being quantified. And there are qualities that we should design for that is more along the lines of being artistic, or if you are an urban designer, ideas that are not easily described in numbers, nor are they easily measured. So it really leads to this idea of a subjective experience, which I will get into when I talk about user experience, right? So, but for now, I think this slide shows safety and security. I think it's hard to argue that without safety and security, you can really have a truly good experience. So imagine a very well-built cycle highway, but for some reason, either it's lack of safety from traffic or lack of social safety, so there's a lack of lighting or some other aspects. You can have something that's short and direct and functional, but without safety, it's hard to hit the other higher orders levels of what makes for excellent bicycle infrastructure. So we'll return to this in a bit. But first, the broader context of what I think is interesting about studying bicycle highways, and that's what got me into this research, is this convergence of a few different trends. Right. So on this slide, I've listed 4 different trends around, let's say, the cycling mobility system. So we're going to focus on the bicycle highway. But around this, you also see developments in mass adoption of e-bikes, right, which allows for cyclists, not just the racing cyclists, but all cyclists, access to consistently higher speeds on the bike path. Bike sharing opens up opportunities for shorter trips, right? And also opens up opportunities for using the bike, taking the train, and then taking a bike at a new location, which leads us to the fourth aspect, which is the bike train system, right? So taking a bike, using the train as a portal to get to point B, 50, 100 kilometers away, and then picking up the bike and cycling again. And what's there to note about the bike train system is if we were to think about just the speed of bicycle highways, we also think about, with this increased speed, what are we competing with, right? So the narrative is that we're competing with the automobile. But if you look at many places in the European context, what we have in fact is we're building bicycle highways next to rail corridors. Convenient because you automatically have underpasses and overpasses, but then now you're competing with the train system, which is not necessarily the most effective use of resources. Perhaps more effective would be a complementary system, right? That better competes against the highway and automobility. So let's go into a bit about bicycle highways, and then I'll talk about the cycling experience using cycle highways as an example. Okay, so what is a bicycle highway? A cycle highway, this is according to a definition from the CHIPS. It was a CHIPS, C-H-I-P-S. It was a European Union funded study from, I was involved in it 4 years ago. And it says that cycle highway is a functional cycling connection, a backbone of the cycling network, and it connects cities or suburbs, right? And satisfies, so that's what I'm going to get to, is that the last part, satisfies its potential users, right? So note the key terms here in bold: functional, backbone, connectivity, and satisfaction, of which the last one is the one that I'm most interested, right? So what is it not, right? You see all these points down here. It's perhaps not a recreational corridor, for example. And given those, you have these 5 criteria: safety, coherence, directness, comfort, attractiveness. Later on in the series, you're going to hear from Mr. Talens, who is going to talk about the CRO manual from the Netherlands, and that will also cover on these aspects. But we'll save this for another webinar. I just wanted to highlight it here, that these happen to also be the criteria for bicycle highways. So here's a question, right? What does comfort and pleasure mean? And what do we mean when we talk about bicycle experience, right? How does it satisfy its potential users? And that got me into this journey of really rethinking the mobility system entirely, right? And what is travel? Is it negative utility necessarily? And what are its benefits and negative impacts, positive and negative impacts on society? So here is a position that I take, and that a few scholars are starting to take, especially in the social sciences. And it's this: we posit that in transport planning, we have a severe case of A to B-ism, where we assume that the origin and destination matter more than the journey itself. We assume that the journey has negative utility, right? And that's the assumption behind decreasing travel times, making direct connections, et cetera, et cetera. Not incorrect per se, but I do want to highlight this because this underlies our impetus to reduce travel times as a primary goal. And that goal sometimes works with an alternate idea of providing for better experiences. Sometimes we lose another objective, or we subsume another objective, which is creating for great cycling experiences, and we subsume it to this severe case of A to B-ism, right? You may have seen wide bike paths that are otherwise pretty well designed, are safe and direct, right? Those are the bottom 2 levels of the modified Maslow's hierarchy, but perhaps they don't hit any of the points above, right? Perhaps it's a direct commuter route that's really a straight path with not much to look at and is really not that much fun to bike through. So how do we study this idea of cycling experiences, right? So in my research, it's become clear to me that large sample sizes, which many of us pursue in quantitative research, it captures preferences, right? We can say, okay, we can even do in-field trials where do you prefer A or B, B or C? And then you have transient prop, do you prefer A or C, right? So if we get large enough sample sizes, and if you imagine these as alternate routes that we can take, then we can get a clear idea of whether A is better than B is better than C, and the ordering of that. But what about motivation? Motivation is a bit more tricky, right? We can know precisely what cyclists prefer in general by studying route choice, for example. But why do they prefer this, right? If you imagine a video game where you could magically run realistic experiments on the same route with trees, without trees, the same route with mountain scenery. You know, this is a Swiss webinar after all, right? Mountains in the background versus cloudy weather and cloudy days, as we see in the Netherlands. You know, what exactly is it that causes these preferences? And then the idea of motivation, right? How do we feel? Why is it that we prefer A to B? And that's a much more difficult field to study. I unfortunately don't have good answers for you, but I am going to lay out the differences between these approaches, right? So it seems to me like cycling research is currently divided between revealed preferences and stated preferences, right? So what do I mean by that, right? So revealed preferences, a big advantage we have now as opposed to 15 years ago. I don't know if you're around as a researcher 15 years ago, but to do a GPS study, you had to give participants this little, it's almost like a pager device, right? And you had to ask them, can you please carry this device with you everywhere you go? And remember to charge it every evening, right? And over a time of a week, we can then gather enough GPS data, and you would give these black boxes to, let's say, 20 people, and then the next week you would give it to another 20 people, and in the end you would have 100 GPS tracks, right? Those were the early days of GPS studies, but they weren't very reliable. People wouldn't carry these black boxes around. It would run out of battery, and people sometimes give them back late, give them back early, and it was a lot of effort on the researcher's part. Nowadays, right, GPS studies are relatively easy to do. You can do it through an app, ask for consent, and voila, you have a device that people carry with them basically everywhere, and that's the smartphone. So it's become increasingly easy to do GPS type studies, but I am now wondering, what is the connection and how do we synergize between these types of studies, whether it's GPS, recall survey, travel diaries, I'll call it revealed preference, versus stated preference, right? Stated preference is an insight into people's mindset, whether it's a mindset or a perception about the environment, as we can do with scenarios and infrastructure types. We can be like, do you prefer green routes? Do you prefer bike lanes 2 meters wide, 4 meters wide? We can run A/B tests, for example, on pictures and see what people prefer, right? Or theoretically prefer. Or we can go on the left side, which is these revealed preference. So what people have actually done. And in between here, we can get a rich data set, because on the revealed preference side, we can really know in detail how many people, if we asked 1,000 people to carry around this GPS device, how many people chooses route A versus how many people chooses route B, and then we can get a glimpse into the overall preferences. And then we can move to a stated preference survey using scenarios, for example. Why do all these people pick A instead of B, right? Because the fact that they pick A instead of B doesn't give you the reason of why that happens. It just gives you some ideas into the overall parameters as that type of infrastructure or route exists now. So why is it? Is it because you like the trees? Is it because you can ride along with your friends? Is it because just what you've always done and you've never thought about route B, right? And trying to gain more insight into the mindset of that choice. So I was thinking about this, and part of this is trying to figure out these two categories, right? So you can figure out what people are doing, or you can go inside out and figure out like what people think about what they're doing, right? And the second one is much more difficult to get to. So asking people what their motivations are, A, it's time consuming. B, people may not know exactly why they chose what they chose. So it takes some creative methodologies to be able to get the truth as the people perceive it to be, but also it takes a lot of effort to then validate that, right? Because sometimes what I say is the reasons for my choice is not necessarily the reason when you mention a third reason, for example. So if I choose a route, I mention that I like greenery, or I get 100 people and they're like, ah, yeah, greenery is great. What if the real reason is there's this traffic light in the middle that really hampers my progress, but we kind of don't mention that, or we forget to, and it's lost amongst the more prominent reasons, right? So it's difficult to measure people's motivations. Why does this matter? Because we have a set guidelines for whether it's bicycle infrastructure. You hear about the CRO manual from the Netherlands in a few webinars from now, but you also have these guidelines for bicycle highways, right? And they're in practice very functional guidelines. They provide the necessary grounds for building good infrastructure, but perhaps they're not sufficient grounds for building good infrastructure, right? Necessary, but not sufficient. And I'd be interested to figure out what is necessary and sufficient, but it's more difficult to figure out once you get into the higher order experiences, right? Like I was cycling in Switzerland a couple of years back, and really there is this feeling of awe, right, when you're cycling in the mountains, and it's a very particular feeling. And I had a really great time on that trip. The infrastructure was okay, but it was a background, and it was this this placemaking, or it was nature, but one can imagine similar in the city where beautiful buildings that really made it a really good experience. Here's some more ideas about bicycle highways. So there was that list, but now illustrated from the Interreg CHIPS project I was talking about earlier. Right, so it's also designing for all users, right? Different users have different preferences and motivations. So then I thought maybe bicycle highways is a misnomer. You have perhaps one way to look at this in the framework is you have the traffic zone or the social zone, right? On the one hand, this is a diagram from Ben Hamilton Bailey, modeled after Mondrian, right? The single purpose, uniform, regulated, predictable in the traffic zone, and then the social zone, multifunctional, diverse, culturally defined, personal, unpredictable. And I wonder which zone is cycling in. I think more in the social zone, but that's not what the consensus is around the world, right? And that's what makes this question very interesting. So the question is designing bicycle infrastructure like this, building a highway, or is it more like an architect, right? Is it the tension between uniformity and variation that makes cycling the best cycling infrastructures so great? You need some elements, right? Like wayfinding, which I'll cover right after these slides, that you need to make it clear where people are going and make it easy to follow. But is there also a necessity for variation within cycling infrastructure, right? What on an extreme example, if you built a a sidewalk that is 4 meters wide and you apply all the same bicycle highway principles to a pedestrian sidewalk, you'd probably get a very boring pedestrian environment, right? So clearly there's elements of bicycle infrastructure that requires uniformity to make it clear to cyclists that they are on the right route, that they have sufficient wayfinding to know that they're on the path to their destination. But perhaps too much of that also leads to boringness, right? So this is from the catalog, one of the brochures of the West Rhine-Westphalia region. So this was their 2014 plan. And this was on the 3rd page, right? So this was their idea of a bicycle highway. And that got me thinking, yeah, is this it, right? Is this kind of what we're going for in all of the guidelines? And I have trouble believing that this literal interpretation is what we're trying to go for when we talk about good cycling experiences. But this is one conceptualization. Perhaps we can move the needle to something a bit more gentle, a bit more variation, and here are some ideas on how to get there. So let's talk about wayfinding, right? So wayfinding, we were talking about before this webinar about these knooppunten in the Netherlands, which is these dots that you follow and you go from number to number. And it's really like a game of Pac-Man, right? Except on a bike, you go to dot number 61, and then the next one you go to dot number 62, 75, and you kind of really chart your route. So in the Netherlands, they came out with a different type of wayfinding, and this is what they named the metro style. So this is instead of that idea, now it's lined up and drawing analogies, not from a car highway, but from a metro network where you have dots along the route. So I thought that was a pretty interesting project that they're working on. And they decided to do some research into wayfinding, right? And the question is this: what makes users identify as a cycle highway? And how do you leverage wayfinding to make the experience better? Link to the paper after this webinar. So the project was this. It was 11 mile. This is for an American audience. I did this before. So 18-kilometer pilot route on the smaller city of Waalwijk, between Tilburg and Waalwijk in the Netherlands, and located along this highway mostly. We took 12 Dutch e-bike users who are unfamiliar with the route, and we basically wanted to see A, how well they're able to follow the wayfinding, and then B, what their experience was, right? So not only that the signage and the commuting and the speed is all up to standard, but also how they felt qualitatively in terms of using the route in general. Here are some example signboards. There were 2 variations on the project. And then here are the 2 concepts of the variation. I believe this is now, I haven't followed up on this project, but it's either been accepted or revised at the national level. And if this project went well, then it could be ideas that you can implement in the Netherlands or elsewhere. The point is not whether or not they implemented. The point is these are some, I think, pretty interesting ideas for anywhere around the world, right? If you're designing dedicated bicycle infrastructure. How was your overall experience? So the overall experience improved. And some key lessons from this project. So I actually rode along and took some videos of people along this route while they were cycling past, and reviewed these videos to see not only whether or not they got lost. Those were pretty easy indicators to jot down quantitatively, but also what their thoughts were on the road. So we gave them microphones and they were able to describe their experiences. Okay, so a few lessons we learned is that design matters, right? And that signs really go a long way. But it's not only just science, but also an education, because this was one of the first ones in the Netherlands on how to use these signs and what the concept is. And it turns out that good wayfinding, when you combine a high quality design, as you find in the cycle highway standards, but you combine that with clear wayfinding, you actually get higher levels of relaxation, right? So it leads to, in particular, knowing where you are going leads to an overall better experience. As for the route itself, we weren't able to come to any concrete conclusions before and after, but people had very good feedback. There's a section through the forest, there are distinct sections along the highway, for example, and people tend to like the section in the forest better, right? And people gave a lot of excuses or reasons for why they think they like it. But in that piece of research, right, I would have really liked to sit down afterwards and get into more detail. Like, okay, so you like greenery. What exactly about the greenery? And really dive into what in particular made it such a great experience. So key point is here, down bottom right in blue, clear cycling infrastructure improves cyclists' level of relaxation. And they're on e-bikes, so they're not having a very intense ride through there. Okay? And why all of this, right? Why all of this research is for me, it's trying to figure out not just a quantitative, let's say minimum floor for what is required for good bicycle infrastructure. I think we have a pretty good grasp on that. And in the lectures about the Crow Manual, especially in the Netherlands, there's really a good body of knowledge around how to build infrastructure that meets minimum standards that will give you good directness, good safety, making sure that the distance, for example, that going from one neighborhood to another, that it's not 20, 30 kilometers, right? That it's actually within commuting distance. So therefore it's sensible to expect people to use that on a daily basis. But also going up into the qualitative, I'd call it enablers of cycling, right? So we move from the quantitative bottom limits, so what limits people from cycling, towards a discussion about how do you enable people to cycle. And that is a much more difficult discussion because there's really no ceiling for enablers. I mean, the ceiling is 100% mode share, right? But when you're talking about outside the Dutch context, most places have under 10%, right? Most places have under 10% cycling mode share. And therefore, in practical terms, there's a lot of room for building in these enablers of cycling that even if we implement all the necessary minimum standards, we don't necessarily get to a much higher mode share. And that's where we're finding, not in the context where like the US, where you have 1% mode share, but when you get to like the 9-10%, your infrastructure is okay, but how do you encourage people to bike even more and really give the carrot instead of the stick, right? And that becomes more important as you increase the population of cyclists until you get to marginal, the more marginal people who are on the fence, it's more difficult to capture them. All right, so we go from another way, quantitative indicators to qualitative indicators. So that is my thoughts on this issue. So now we go around Europe for some bits of inspiration. So I do YouTube videos that are funded by the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. And that takes me to different places where I can investigate transit, walking, and cycling in the cities and provide like an experiential perspective. So I'll leave you in this presentation with a few ideas that perhaps you can implement. So we'll go first to Berlin, Germany, right? And one of the arguments that comes up often against bicycle infrastructure is that there's not enough space. So that I thought, isn't that interesting? What if we went somewhere where that is not a constraint, or I mean, it could if you're going for, I guess, a highway in the middle of the city, but let's go somewhere where it's practically not really a constraint and see what the engineers have come up with. And this is Karl Marx Alley in Berlin, Germany. So let's go take a ride and see what we can learn. And now I'm going to unlock one of these rental bikes from Donkey Republic with my phone, and we'll take you on a ride through Karl Marx Alley.
Back in my bag and I gotta brag, I do this shit for real. When we was down and we had nothing, we had to share a meal.
This grand avenue was constructed in 1952, and it has space for 6 lanes of traffic, a large grassy median, plus we still got all this space for a wide bike lane. Along with the 89-meter right-of-way, you also have these gigantic roundabouts that are dotted throughout Karl Marx Alley. Hey, look who I found. It's Karl Marx himself. For this massive roundabout, they found a pretty intuitive way to deal with cycling traffic around it. There are signals at each crossing, but you get routed up to the sidewalk and you get separated from the 6 lanes of cars that go around. I appreciate how they've taken such a militarily inspired streetscape and made it into something that's relatively pleasant. Yeah, that's I see this in quite a few cities, right? Especially the post-war development on these wide boulevards where the usual arguments against bike lanes, right? Parking, you don't want to take away parking spaces, etc., don't really apply. So then how do you create good experiences in these relatively wide right-of-ways? One idea is to create completely separated infrastructure, right? So taking the boulevard idea and taking the bike path into its own right-of-way in a way. So you have the car traffic, and then you have lines of trees, and then you have a separate realm in itself. So having the pedestrian and cycling realm completely separated from the motor vehicle realm. And if you have enough space, then there's an opportunity to do that. So creating your own sub-ecosystem along the same right-of-way. You see that in places like Barcelona, where there's extensive use of boulevards, so the middle traffic sewer, and then on 2 sides you have trees separating the pedestrian or the more quiet realms. And there's opportunities here with cities with large right-of-ways. You can have tram tracks, you can have traffic, you can have everything. But perhaps what would be here a better idea is to further segregate the pedestrian realm and really design it in a way that's much more human scale and making a clear division between cycling, pedestrians, and motor traffic. So the next concept, because we were talking about wayfinding and metro-style wayfinding, I think this touches a bit about cycling, but more about transit. Just think about how we can make cycling intuitive in the same way. And this is creative metro wayfinding in Prague, Czechia. There are 3 lines in the Prague metro system. The deepest station is on the A line. Let's go. This timer shows you how long before the next train leaves. And this timer shows you how long since the last train left. I think this is super clever. It uses the map format to show you which way to go on the stairs. Follow the lines to the A train. The map theme comes back once again, this time to show us whether to go to track 1 or track 2. We're now 53 meters underground in the deep. So that's intuitiveness, right? And that's why I really felt in the Prague metro system is what was on the map completely matches up with the physical environment. Now that was a very good connection to we talk about cycling infrastructure, because we haven't figured out a good way on how to make cycling infrastructure intuitive, right? And intuitive in a way that's also good for recreation use, where maybe you don't want to fish out your phone all the time, but also intuitive in a way to make sure you don't get lost on your way to a more commuting destination, right? We use signposts, we use some concepts, but I think there's room to develop there around the user experience and making it a natural extension of what we do to get around when we're on a bike. And perhaps a less positive example. So this is the opposite of 2 examples ago where we had too much space. This is what happens when you're very space constrained. This is in Budapest, Hungary.
I'm standing on the banks of the Danube River, but you wouldn't know it. There's a highway to my right, there's a highway to my left, and there's a highway on the bridge above me. The one good thing about this stretch is that there's a major tram line that goes north and south along the river. However, there's a complete lack of green space, and it's very loud here. This is the only sliver of sidewalk I get along the Danube River. I'm surrounded by traffic, and I just wish there was more pedestrian space so I can take my time and enjoy. This narrow 2-meter wide path is blockaded by barriers on both sides, and it's really difficult to squeeze through. This cyclist, for example, has to wait for this group of pedestrians to pass. It's a beautiful view, lots of people walk here, but it's all given over to cars.
Of course, the other bank of the river is much nicer than this side. But I was using this as an example for what happens if you completely don't meet the minimum standards, right? So it's during the peak tourist season, it's basically impossible to cycle there, even though that is the shared infrastructure you're supposed to use. I will give you one more, perhaps ending this on a more inspiration note. And this example comes to us from Warsaw, Poland, and how you can leverage the waterfront and use wide and expansive infrastructure far beyond the minimum design standards, but also fitting it in between the recreation motive and the commuting motive, right? So this piece of infrastructure serves both for recreation use and commuting use.
This cable-stayed bridge was built in the year 2000 and crosses the Vistula River that divides Warsaw, Poland. To make room for this bridge, they had to move the former highway into a tunnel, creating the park space that we see today. Imagine this was once a massive 6-lane highway. But they had to bury it underground because it has only 3 meters of clearance and you can't get trucks under the bridge. What a great urban gym here. You have a skate park in the back and lots of places to stay healthy, all under a highway underpass that's next to the river.
And that's they've done a lot actually with that project, and just seeing what you can do with very valuable infrastructure along the riverfront. You probably know places where there's highways just going across, whether it's the waterfront, whether it's some very beautiful scenery that could be easily reimagined for much more active transportation purposes, reclaiming it back to people and giving a good experience to the inhabitants of the space, which is what I think bicycle infrastructure should also be about, right? We started with the idea of creating high quality infrastructure, but where we want to end up ultimately is making better spaces for human-centered cities. So thank you very much. And Patrick is now going to moderate a quick discussion on the topic.